There were debts that gold could not pay. The old world understood this. The world before contracts written in ink on parchment, before coin changed hands in market squares loud with the voices of merchants, before kingdoms rose with their courts of law and their magistrates who weighed justice on scales of silver. Long before any of that, there was the moment when one human pulled another from death's reach. The moment after, when the saved stood before the Savior and found nothing adequate to offer in return. What price for a life? The question had no answer, could never have an answer. A life saved was a debt beyond measurement, beyond the capacity of mortal accounting. And so the old world, which understood debts in ways the later ages would forget, created something stranger than payment. It created the law of surprise. Accounts of its origin fracture into many paths, whether these represent separate births of the same idea or tributaries flowing from a single forgotten source, remains a matter lost to time's erosion. What persists are the stories themselves, worn smooth by countless retellings, their edges blurred but their essence preserved. In lands where Slavic tongues shaped the names of forests and rivers, elders spoke of a compact older than the memory of kingdoms. When a human made bargain with forces that dwelt in shadows, with devils who walked between worlds, with entities whose nature defied comfortable naming, payment took forms that mortal minds struggled to comprehend. The devil's service demanded the devil's price. Give me what awaits you at home, but which you don't yet know. The words carried weight beyond their meaning. They opened doors to futures unwritten, bound fates that had not yet crystallized into being. When the traveler returned home to discover his wife with child, or found a foal born in his absence, or encountered any manner of unexpected fortune, this became the payment, not chosen, not negotiated, arrived at through the mechanism of surprise itself. Some versions of these old accounts claim the custom originated precisely there, in those transactions with the unclean powers, that it began as a form of tribute to darkness. Others suggest something more ancient still, predating even those shadow bargains, reaching back to times when humans first recognized that some debts exceeded the capacity of material exchange. Fragments preserved in written form centuries later reference a story from sacred texts. A warrior named Jephthah sought victory in battle against the Ammonites. He made oath to his God that if granted success, he would sacrifice the first thing to emerge from his house to greet him upon his return home. Victory came. He returned. His daughter, his only child, ran to meet him at the threshold. The accounts do not agree on what followed. Some versions claim he honored the vow through sacrifice. Others suggest different resolutions, ways of fulfilling the bargain without blood. But all versions agree on the essential horror, the bargain made without knowledge of its cost, the price revealed only after the debt became binding. The shape of the thing remained constant across variations, promise without knowledge, payment determined by accident or fate or whatever name one gives to the uncontrollable forces that govern what happens next. Russian tales collected by those who traveled the vast steppes and forests, gathering stories from peasant hearths and noble courts alike, preserved another manifestation. A king or soldier or hunter, the accounts differ on the specifics, as oral traditions tend to do, encountered an eagle wounded in some great conflict. He aided the bird. In gratitude, the eagle carried him through the sky and gifted him marvelous objects, caskets of gold and silver that opened at a word. But the man could not close them once opened. Magic has costs. Magic has rules. A figure appeared. In some versions, this figure wore the aspect of the Sea Tsar, ruler of the waters that covered half the world. In others, a different power manifested, but the essence remained constant, a being of sufficient might to close what mortal hands could not seal. The being offered help. The being demanded payment. Give me that which you possess, but do not know you possess. The man agreed. What choice did he have? With magic spilling forth, unable to contain the power he had thoughtlessly unleashed? He returned home to discover his wife had borne him a son during his absence. The child belonged to the Sea Tsars. The bargain was sealed. Years later, when the boy reached the age of understanding, he went to fulfill his father's debt, journeying to underwater realms where human lungs should not draw breath. But stories being what they are, carriers of truth wrapped in symbol, the tale did not end in tragedy. The boy found help in impossible places, met someone who saw value in him beyond the bargain that brought him there, escaped back to the world of air and earth, though not without cost. The tale survived because it illustrated the principle. The law of surprise was not cruelty, though it could manifest as such. It was inevitability. It was fate asserting itself through the mechanism of debt. Scholars of later ages, those who studied the old stories and attempted to trace their lineages, found the motif everywhere. It appeared in German tales where princes cursed into beast forms invoked the law to break their enchantments. It surfaced in Scottish ballads where heroes bound themselves to otherworldly forces through promises of the unexpected. It echoed through Irish songs and Estonian fireside narratives and Czech village stories. The specifics shifted, the cosmetic details changed with geography and culture, but the core remained immutable. A life saved, a debt beyond price, payment deferred to the moment of return. What you find but did not expect becomes mine. One interpretation of these many variants suggests they represent not separate inventions, but rather memories of a single, more ancient custom that predated the cultures which preserved its echoes. Perhaps there was a time when all humans, regardless of where they lived or what gods they honored, recognized this particular form of obligation. Perhaps the law of surprise truly was, as the phrase claimed, as old as humanity itself, or perhaps not. Perhaps each culture independently arrived at the same solution to the same intractable problem: how to pay a debt that cannot be paid. How to acknowledge that some acts of salvation transcend any possible recompense except the relinquishment of choice itself. The surprise, the unknown thing, the unexpected fortune represented fate intervening destiny, taking the decision from human hands. That aspect proved crucial. The saved person did not choose what to give. The Savior did not demand a specific payment. Both parties submitted to whatever awaited discovery. In that submission lay the sacred quality that made the law binding beyond normal oaths. It was a gamble, as those who invoked it acknowledged. The surprise could prove trivial: a bumper crop, a loyal dog, a favorite hunting hawk. It could prove unsettling: a wife's new lover discovered in the conjugal bed, a long-absent mother-in-law arrived to make her judgments known. Or it could prove profound: a child, conceived or born during absence, whose existence created a bond deeper than any contract. The gamble worked both ways. The one who invoked the law accepted whatever fate provided. They could not choose. They could not revise their claim upon discovering that the surprise disappointed them. The law, once invoked, became absolute, and the one who owed the debt could not refuse, not without consequences. What those consequences might be, the old stories disagreed. Some suggested supernatural retribution, plague, misfortune, madness. Others pointed to more mundane but equally devastating outcomes: loss of honor, exile from community. The weight of oath-breaking that would follow a man like Stench follows corruption. Whether the punishment came from gods or devils, or simply from the social fabric that held communities together, the result remained. The law of surprise, once properly invoked, demanded fulfillment. But invocation required specific conditions. Not every life saved created grounds for the law. Not every debt qualified. The accounts that survived suggested certain requirements, though none stated them explicitly as rules. Rather, they emerged from pattern, from the common elements that appeared across variations. First, the service rendered must be of sufficient magnitude. Saving a life qualified. Preventing certain death created the necessary weight. Minor assistance, however helpful, did not reach the threshold. The debt had to be absolute, the obligation beyond question. Second, the saved must offer recompense and find themselves unable to provide adequate payment. This could take the form of genuine poverty, having nothing of value to give, or it could manifest as the recognition that no material payment could balance the scales. Either way, the moment of inadequacy had to occur, the acknowledgement that normal exchange could not resolve the obligation. Third, the Savior must invoke the law using the proper phrasing. Words mattered. Give me what you find at home, but do not expect. The first thing that greets you upon your return. The formulations varied, but they shared common elements: the unknown, the unexpected, the deferred revelation. Simply asking for whatever you own but don't know about would not suffice. The phrasing had to invoke the principle of surprise itself. Fourth, both parties must accept the terms before the saved returned home. Once the bargain concluded, once the words were spoken and acknowledged, it became sealed. Changes of mind afterward held no power. The law transcended individual will. These elements, distilled from hundreds of accounts across dozens of cultures, suggested something systematic beneath the mythology. Perhaps the law of surprise represented not merely folklore, but an actual historical practice, a method communities had developed for handling certain categories of debt. Perhaps people really did make such bargains, really did give away children or other unexpected fortunes to those who had saved their lives. Or perhaps the stories themselves constituted the social technology, cautionary tales that taught important lessons. Be careful making promises. Understand that debts have weight. Recognize that fate or chance or divine will plays a role in human affairs that cannot be controlled or predicted. Whether actual practice or purely symbolic teaching, the law of surprise embedded itself deep in cultural memory. It became one of those concepts that required no explanation, that listeners understood immediately, even if they had never heard the specific term before. The shape of it felt familiar, resonant with something ancient in human experience. In the world that would eventually be called the continent, that land where humans arrived late, where other races had walked for millennia before human feet touched its soil, the law of surprise came with the humans themselves. It arrived as part of the cultural inheritance brought through the conjunction of the spheres, that cataclysmic event which shattered boundaries between worlds, and deposited human refugees onto shores where they were neither expected nor initially welcomed. The humans who survived that transition brought their stories, brought their customs, brought their understanding of how debts worked and what obligations meant. The law of surprise came with them, one of countless traditions carried across the dimensional threshold, preserved through the chaos of arrival and the desperate centuries that followed. And on the continent, in the new world that humans would reshape through their presence, the law found fertile ground. It adapted to new circumstances, new relationships, new manifestations of the eternal problem, how to pay the unpayable debt. Some of the oldest accounts preserved in continent lore, stories told when writing was still rare and history lived primarily in memory, referenced the law in context that suggested it was already well established, already understood as fundamental custom. Bards sang of legendary heroes, druids recited genealogies of notable families, and through these recitations, the law of surprise appeared as constant thread, binding fates across generations. One such legendary figure bore the name Zatret Voruta, though the specifics of his existence, whether he lived at all, and if so when, remained matters of debate among those few scholars who studied such things. The accounts agreed on certain elements. He became a great hero. He wielded a blade named Balmor. He accomplished deeds worthy of songs. And he began as a surprise. His father, whether nobleman or merchant, or simply a man of sufficient importance to be remembered, encountered death in some form. The exact nature varied by telling. An injury, a monster, an ambush by bandits, something that would have killed him, but he was saved. The savior, in the accounts that survived, was of dwarf kind, one of the races that predated humans on the continent, shorter of stature but longer of memory. The dwarf invoked the law, not for cruelty, not even perhaps with particular thought to what the payment might be, just following the custom as custom was followed. When the man reached home, the first thing to greet him was his young son, running to embrace the father he thought lost. Zatret Voruta went to live among the dwarves, was raised in their halls, learned their ways, became something neither fully human nor fully accepted into dwarf society, but from that hybrid upbringing came greatness. The account suggested his time with the dwarves shaped his destiny, gave him perspectives and skills that purely human raising would not have provided, whether this represented historical fact or mythological. Justification for the law, proof that surprises could lead to fortunate outcomes, remained unclear. Stories have purposes beyond simple record-keeping. They teach, they justify, they make sense of customs whose origins lie too far back to see clearly. Another name survived in the fragmentary accounts, Mad De, or De, depending on which linguistic tradition preserved the story. Even less is known of this figure than of Zatret Voruta. The surviving references called him Mad, though whether this represented literal mental affliction or simply served as honorific or nickname, the records did not clarify. What the accounts did agree upon, Mad De labored under some manner of curse. The nature of the curse was not preserved. Perhaps it was transformation, perhaps compulsion, perhaps some more esoteric affliction, but it weighed upon him, and he sought release. A traveler crossed his path. Perhaps days saved the traveler's life. Perhaps the traveler stumbled into day's domain and survived by chance, creating obligation through the rules of hospitality that governed interactions between strangers. The specifics varied. What remained constant was the invocation of the law. Give me what you left at home without knowing. The traveler agreed, returned home, discovered what awaited him, a child, gender unspecified in the accounts, though the name that survived was Supri, which linguistic analysis suggested might be masculine. This child, grown to whatever age Supri achieved before seeking out the one to whom he was bound, somehow possessed the capacity to lift Mad Day's curse, whether through magic, through wisdom, through simple compassion. The accounts did not specify, but the curse lifted, the debt was paid, and presumably both parties found the arrangement, if not ideal, at least acceptable. These stories, Zatret Varuda raised by dwarves, Supri lifting curses, carried specific message. The law of surprise, while potentially tragic, could also facilitate positive outcomes. The surprise could become blessing rather than burden. Destiny, working through the mechanism of unexpected payment, might lead to results that straightforward transaction could never achieve. But the stories also carried darker lessons. There was a queen who thought herself clever enough to cheat fate. Her name was Zivelina. She ruled in Metinia, one of the southern realms that rose and fell in the centuries before the northern kingdoms consolidated their power. How she came to rule, whether by birth or marriage or more complicated succession, the accounts that survived did not preserve. What they did preserve was the manner of her ascension. Zivelina sought the crown. Whether she had rightful claim or seized power through ambition, the telling did not clarify, but she lacked something necessary to secure her position. Resources, perhaps. Allies, the particular form of leverage that transforms aspiration into achievement. She found assistance in unexpected quarters, a gnome. The accounts named him Rumpelstelt, and anyone who knew the old stories from beyond the continent, stories that somehow paralleled tales told in this world, would recognize the shape of what followed gnomes. The first of the speaking peoples to walk the continent had lived there longest, had seen the most, knew things others did not. Rumpelstelt possessed means to place Zivelina on the throne, whether through magic, through political maneuvering, through knowledge of secrets that could topple rivals. The specific method was lost. What remained was the essential fact. He could make her queen. He did make her queen. The price he named was traditional. Your firstborn child. Not the law of surprise in its classic formulation. He specified exactly what he wanted, rather than leaving it to fate's revelation. But close enough in principle, the payment would be something that did not yet exist, something whose nature Zivelina could not fully anticipate. A child not yet conceived, whose reality remained theoretical. Perhaps she thought she could avoid conception. Perhaps she planned to remain childless, to cheat the bargain through simple abstinence. Perhaps she genuinely intended to honor the agreement when she made it, and only changed her mind later when the child became real, became hers, became unbearable to relinquish. The accounts did not speculate on her reasoning. She bore a child. Rumpelstiltskin came to collect his payment, and Zivelina refused. She was queen now. She commanded power. She had resources that she lacked when making the original bargain. And gnomes, for all their ancient knowledge, were small, physically vulnerable. She could simply deny him, drive him away with threats or magic or soldiers. The method varied by account, but the result remained constant. Rumpelstiltskin departed without his payment. The bargain was broken. The debt remained unpaid. Both Zivelina and her child died of plague shortly thereafter. The accounts presented this as direct consequence, not mere coincidence, not simply the unfortunate reality that plague struck often in those times, claiming nobles and peasants with equal disregard for station. The tellers of the story emphasized the causal connection. She broke faith with the law of surprise, and death followed. One does not dice with destiny, with impunity. The phrase appeared in multiple versions of the tale, suggesting it was considered the essential lesson. The law of surprise was not merely custom. It was not a suggestion that could be ignored if one possessed sufficient power to resist enforcement. It was a law in a deeper sense. Law as in natural principle, as in the rules that governed how reality functioned. Break it, and reality breaks you in return. Whether this represented actual cosmic justice or simply the storyteller's moral interpretation remained deliberately ambiguous. Perhaps Zevelina and her child genuinely died because she violated the law. Perhaps they died of ordinary plague that happened to strike at a narratively convenient moment, and later tellers drew the connection to reinforce the importance of keeping one's word. Either way, the story served its purpose. It circulated, it was repeated. It became one of the cautionary examples invoked when explaining why the law of surprise must be honored. Even queens, even those who commanded armies and treasuries, could not safely refuse once the bargain was made. The tale of Zevelina and Rumpelstiltskin became shorthand for a particular category of error, attempting to use power to escape obligation. Later references, in Druidic teachings, in bardic performances, in the conversations of those few who studied the old ways, would cite her name as warning, "Remember Zevelina," as if everyone should know what that meant, as if the story had embedded itself so thoroughly in cultural consciousness that merely invoking the name sufficed to convey the lesson. But the story also illustrated something else, something the tellers did not always make explicit. The law of surprise created permanent bonds, not just the initial transaction, but ongoing connection between the parties involved. The savior and the saved remained linked, the one who invoked the law and the surprise itself, particularly when that surprise proved to be a child, entered into a relationship that transcended normal social ties. This became most apparent in cases where the surprise was indeed a child, not a harvest or an animal or some material good that could be transferred and forgotten, but a human life whose existence now carried dual nature, child of their birth parents, but also child of the one who invoked the law. Such children came to be known, in the tradition that developed around the law, as children of surprise, or unexpected children. The terms were used interchangeably, though subtle differences in emphasis might appear depending on context. Child of surprise emphasized the mechanism of their binding. Unexpected child emphasized their sudden appearance in lives that did not anticipate them. These children occupied unique position in social structure. They belonged to their families of origin by blood and immediate raising, but they also belonged to the one who held their debt by right of the law. This dual belonging created complications. Some families accepted it, some resisted, some tried to negotiate exceptions or substitutions. Could not gold be offered instead? Could not some other payment satisfy the debt? The accounts that touched on such attempts suggested they uniformly failed. Once invoked properly, the law permitted no alteration. The surprise was the surprise, it could not be exchanged for something more convenient. The question of when the child should be surrendered, if surrender was even the correct term, appeared to vary based on circumstances. Some accounts suggested immediate transfer, the child given over as soon as the claim was made. Others described arrangements where the child remained with their birth family for some years before going to fulfill their destiny with the one who held their debt. In cases where the one invoking the law was an individual, rather than an institution, personal relationship often developed. The child might be raised as foster child or apprentice, might learn skills or knowledge they would not have encountered in their original family, might eventually inherit from their second parent, their parent by law, in ways that complicated normal lines of succession. In cases where the invoker represented a tradition or organization, and here the accounts began to shift from ancient legend to more recent, more verifiable history, the child might be brought into that tradition, trained in its ways, absorbed into its community. This is where Witchers enter the story. But before examining that specific application, the mechanics themselves required closer attention. The law of surprise functioned through precise linguistic formulation. Words were not ornamental. They constituted the mechanism by which the law was invoked and bound. Two primary phrasings appeared across the accounts, with minor variations. Give me the first thing that comes to greet you upon your return. Give me what you find at home, yet do not expect. Similar in essential meaning, but different in emphasis. The first phrasing placed attention on the moment of greeting, on the action of approach. This could apply to anything animate, a person, an animal, even conceivably an aggressive pest. If one wanted to interpret aggressively literally, whatever moved to greet first became the payment. The second phrasing emphasized discovery rather than greeting. What awaited finding? What existed but remained unknown until the moment of return revealed it. This formulation expanded the possibilities beyond animate greeters. A new structure built during absence. A treasure unearthed by accident. a problem that had developed unseen, or most commonly, a pregnancy, a child growing in the womb while the father traveled, unknown to him because conception occurred after his departure, or because his wife had not yet recognized the signs, or because she deliberately concealed the knowledge. The surprise was not the child's birth, but the fact of their existence, their presence in the home, despite the father's unawareness. This created interesting temporal questions. If the law was invoked before the father returned home, but the child was born after his return, did the law still apply? Most interpretations suggested yes. The pregnancy itself was the surprise, regardless of when birth occurred. The debt attached at the moment of discovery, which was the moment of returning home to learn of the pregnancy, not the later moment of birth. But accounts existed that suggested different interpretations. Some claimed the child had to be born during the father's absence for the law to properly apply. Others suggested conception during absence was sufficient. Still others argued that any child unknown to the father at the moment he made the bargain qualified, even if conceived and born while he was present, as long as he remained unaware. These variations likely reflected regional differences in how the law was understood and practiced, or they represented evolution over time, as the tradition adapted to changing circumstances, or they simply demonstrated that the law, for all its supposed ancient consistency, was subject to human interpretation like any other custom. What remained consistent across variations was the core principle: knowledge mattered. If the father knew about the child when he made the bargain, that child could not qualify as the surprise. The element of the unknown, the unexpected, was essential. Without that, the law had not been properly invoked. This created obvious opportunities for deception. A father who suspected his wife might be pregnant could deliberately delay his return home, or claim to have just arrived when, in fact, he had been back for days, time enough to learn of the pregnancy through other channels. Or a wife who wished to protect her child could arrange for someone else to greet her husband first, ensuring that a servant or animal took the position of first greeter, rather than the child she wanted to shield. Whether such deceptions violated the spirit of the law, and thus risked supernatural consequence, or whether they were considered fair play within the rules, the accounts did not make clear. Perhaps it varied. Perhaps some practitioners of the tradition took a strict view, while others accepted that cunning had its place in navigating fate's requirements. The question of enforcement remained perpetually murky. Who or what enforced the law of surprise? If someone refused to honor a properly invoked claim, what actually happened? The cautionary tales, Zyvalina dying of plague, unspecified misfortunes befalling unnamed oathbreakers, suggested external enforcement. Something beyond human authority punished violation. Whether this was divine intervention, cosmic justice, or simply the accumulated weight of broken faith manifesting as misfortune, the stories deliberately left ambiguous. But practical enforcement also occurred. Social pressure could be considerable. In communities where honor mattered, where reputation determined one's ability to conduct business or make alliances, being known as one who broke the law of surprise could prove devastating exile from social networks. Refusal of future aid, the kind of slow death that came from being cut off from the web of obligation and reciprocity that allowed humans to survive. And in cases where the one invoking the law possessed power, whether political, military, or magical, more direct enforcement became possible. If a king invoked the law and the debtor refused, that refusal could constitute treason. If a mage invoked it and was denied, curses might follow. If a witcher, but that came later in the accounting. The law also carried implicit assumption about value. When invoked, both parties accepted that whatever the surprise proved to be would constitute adequate payment for the service rendered. This meant that trivial surprises, the aforementioned dog, the harvest, the returned mother-in-law, were understood as valid payment even for significant service, like saving a life. This seemed unbalanced on its surface. Save a man from death, receive his hunting hound in return? Hardly equivalent exchange. But the philosophy underlying the law rejected that kind of equivalence thinking. The point was not balanced exchange. The point was acknowledging that some debts exceeded the capacity of balanced exchange. By invoking the law of surprise, the Savior essentially said, I recognize this debt cannot be truly paid. I accept whatever fate provides as symbolic payment, knowing it will not actually balance the scales, but it will resolve the obligation enough that both parties can move forward without the weight of infinite debt. In that sense, the law of surprise was mechanism for closing debts that otherwise could never close. It allowed both parties to escape the paralysis of unpayable obligation. The saved person gained release from debt that might otherwise hang over them their entire life. Yes, they gave up something, possibly something precious, but they gave it according to fate's decision rather than the Savior's demand. This preserved dignity in a way that negotiated payment might not. They could tell themselves they had no choice. That destiny, rather than personal weakness, compelled the loss. The Savior gained whatever fate provided, but more importantly, gained resolution. They could not be accused of demanding too much or exploiting their position. They took what came, good or bad, accepting the gamble. This preserved honor in a way that demanding specific valuable payment might not. They could tell themselves they acted fairly, letting chance decide rather than pressing their advantage. Both parties submitted to something larger than themselves. In that mutual submission lay the sacred quality that made the law binding in ways normal contracts were not. But submission to fate, submission to destiny, raised philosophical questions that those who thought about such matters, druids, scholars, the occasional witcher during long winters, sometimes debated. Did the law of surprise reveal destiny or create it? When a father returned home to find a newborn child, and that child was claimed a surprise, did that mean the child was always destined for the one who claimed them? Or did the act of claiming create a new destiny that would not have existed otherwise? Put differently, was the child of surprise fated to be a child of surprise before the law was invoked? Or did invoking the law reshape fate itself? The question had no settled answer. Different philosophical traditions interpreted it differently. Some held that destiny was fixed, immutable, and the law of surprise merely revealed connections that already existed in the fabric of fate. The child was always going to end up with their second parent, their parent by law. The biological parents were simply vessels for bringing that destiny into being. Others argued that destiny was flexible, constantly being written and rewritten through human choices. Invoking the law of surprise was one such choice, one that created new destiny, where none existed before the child's fate was genuinely altered by the invocation. Still others proposed that destiny and choice existed in paradoxical relationship, simultaneously true and mutually exclusive. The child was both fated to be claimed and only claimed because someone chose to invoke the law, attempting to separate the two. To determine which came first was category error. They arose together, inseparable. These debates might seem abstract, removed from practical concerns, but they had real implications for how one thought about children of surprise. Were these children tragic figures, stolen from their rightful families by cruel fate? Or were they fortunate ones, guided by destiny toward the path they were meant to walk all along? Or were they simply children caught in the machinery of custom, neither blessed nor cursed, but merely bound by tradition like any other social obligation? The accounts that referenced specific children of surprise suggested all three interpretations had adherents. Some children grew to resent their status, feeling they had been robbed of normal family life. Some embraced it, finding purpose in the unique path open to them. Some regarded it with neither resentment nor enthusiasm, just another fact of existence like height or coloring or any other inherited trait. Zatretvaruta, raised by dwarves, became legendary hero. Perhaps that justified whatever pain his separation from human family caused. Perhaps his destiny truly required dwarf raising to manifest, or perhaps he would have become great regardless, and the law of surprise simply added exotic detail to his origin story. Supri lifted Mad Day's curse. Perhaps only a child of surprise, bound by destiny's peculiar magic, could accomplish such feat. Perhaps any compassionate person could have done the same, and Supri's status was coincidental. The accounts did not provide enough detail to determine causation versus correlation. And Zivalina's child, whose name was not preserved, if it was even known before death claimed both mother and infant, died of plague. Perhaps this was punishment for the mother's violation of law. Perhaps it was simply tragedy that happened to coincide with broken oath. Perhaps the child would have died regardless, and the law of surprise would have made no difference except to give the death narrative meaning. These three examples, positive outcome, neutral to positive outcome, negative outcome, suggested that being a child of surprise did not itself determine fate. The law created bond and obligation, but what followed depended on countless other factors. Though one factor appeared more often than chance alone might explain, Children of surprise seemed to encounter significant events with unusual frequency. They became heroes, or lifted curses, or died young in notable ways. Few accounts existed of children of surprise living ordinary lives, farming or trading, or raising families without dramatic incident. This might represent observational bias. Perhaps many children of surprise lived unremarkable lives, but those lives generated no stories worth preserving. Only the exceptional cases got remembered, creating false impression that the law of surprise itself led to exceptional fate. Or perhaps the law really did create some kind of connection to destiny, some heightened probability of encountering significant events. Perhaps submitting to fate through the mechanism of surprise opened pathways that would otherwise remain closed. Perhaps destiny, however one conceived it, paid special attention to those who acknowledged its authority through this particular custom. The question remained unsettled, would perhaps always remain unsettled. Destiny was not the sort of thing that submitted to empirical testing. One could observe patterns and draw conclusions, but proof was impossible. Faith or skepticism became matters of philosophical disposition rather than demonstrable fact. What was demonstrable was that the custom persisted, generation after generation, across centuries of human presence on the continent. The law of surprise continued to be invoked, not frequently. It was never common, never the default method of resolving debt, but regularly enough that most people knew of it, recognized it when invoked, understood its basic mechanics, even if they never encountered it personally. And certain groups, certain traditions, adopted it as more than occasional practice, made it part of their systematic methods for perpetuation, used it not randomly but deliberately, as tool for recruitment and maintenance of their numbers. The Witchers were not the only ones, but they were the ones who became most identified with the practice, whose use of the law of surprise became so well known that many people believed, incorrectly, that the law existed solely for their benefit, that Witchers had invented or at least claimed exclusive right to its use. They had not. The law was ancient, long before the first Witcher was created. It would continue, or so its practitioners believed, long after the last Witcher died, but Witchers had adapted the law to their specific needs with such effectiveness that the two became linked in common understanding. Witchers needed children, not for warmth or comfort or continuation of bloodline. Witchers were sterile. Their mutations ensured that. They needed children as raw material, as candidates for the trial of the grasses, the excruciating process that might transform a child into a Witcher or might kill them, with odds that varied depending on which account one believed, but were never favorable. Acquiring children was therefore necessary for any Witcher organization to persist, and acquiring the right kind of children, resilient, capable of surviving what most could not, potentially suited to the work, was critical. The law of surprise offered elegant solution. The Witchers did not invent the custom. They inherited it, like they inherited silver swords and knowledge of signs, and the understanding that some monsters could not be reasoned with. When the first Witchers were created, and creation was the correct term for they were made rather than born to their nature, the methods of recruitment had not yet solidified. The early years were experimentation, trial and error, with emphasis on error, with error measured in the bodies of children who did not survive the mutations forced upon them. The mages who designed the process, who crafted the mutagens and established the procedures, needed subjects, children specifically, young enough that their bodies remained plastic, capable of adapting to changes that would kill an adult, old enough to have developed past infancy's fragility, to possess the base strength needed to endure. Where these first children came from, the fragmentary accounts didn't make entirely clear. Some were orphans, certainly. War and plague and simple misfortune created constant supply of children with no families to protect them. Taking such children off the streets, from the temples where they sought shelter, from the desperate circumstances that would likely kill them anyway, this could be presented as mercy rather than exploitation. Some were purchased, gold exchanged for living children, transactions that occurred in shadows because even in harsh times, such commerce drew judgment, but it occurred nonetheless. Poor families sold children they could not feed. Slavers who normally trafficked in adults made exception for the right price. The mages had resources, and children could be acquired if one knew where to look, and possessed stomach for the asking. And some perhaps were taken, stolen in night raids, claimed from villages that resisted, acquired through methods that would not bear examination in daylight. Whether this represented systematic practice or occasional excess by particularly ruthless procurers, the records did not preserve clearly. But all these methods shared common problem. They produced random selection. The children acquired had no necessary connection to the work they would be forced into. No destiny binding them to the path of the witcher. They were convenient raw material, nothing more. Many died. Of those who survived, some emerged damaged, physically functional, but psychologically shattered, capable of killing monsters, but incapable of the judgment needed to determine which targets required killing. The early witchers included successes, but also failures that had to be quietly ended before they could do too much harm. The mages and the surviving witchers who began to take over management of their own tradition recognized they needed better selection method, some principle for identifying children who possessed higher probability of surviving the trials, some way to ensure that those who underwent the mutations had reason beyond random chance to be there. The law of surprise offered solution, though not for the reasons commonly assumed. The usual explanation, the one that circulated in tavern stories and bardic performances, was that children of surprise were somehow marked by destiny, and this destiny marking made them more likely to survive the trials fate itself selected them, and fate would guide them through the horrors of transformation. Perhaps there was truth in that interpretation. Perhaps destiny, however one conceived it, did involve itself. But there was also more practical reasoning. A child of surprise came with built-in justification. The witcher who invoked the law had not stolen the child, had not purchased them like livestock, had not engaged in any of the morally dubious methods that invited retaliation from communities who might decide witchers were worse than the monsters they hunted. Instead, the witcher had saved a life. That was necessary precondition for invoking the law, had offered the saved person a way to resolve unpayable debt through acceptance of fate's decision, had followed ancient custom that predated witchers, that most people recognized as legitimate, even if they found it uncomfortable. This provided social cover, made the recruitment defensible in ways that other methods were not. When a witcher arrived to claim a child of surprise, they came with legal and traditional authority that was difficult to dispute. Oh, the families might resist, might try to hide the child, or offer alternative payment or appeal to local lords for protection, but they did so, knowing they fought against custom that society generally upheld. The child, when old enough to understand, could be told they were honored by destiny, marked out for special purpose, not stolen or purchased, but claimed according to ancient law that governed debts beyond price. This framing made the trauma of separation potentially more bearable, gave it meaning beyond simple misfortune, and perhaps most importantly for the witchers themselves, children of surprise came with some degree of consent, or at least acceptance. The father, it was usually the father, in those times when men traveled more frequently than women, had agreed to the law of surprise, had known, at least in abstract, that the surprise might be his child. When that proved true, he carried responsibility for the bargain, could not claim complete innocence. This reduced guilt. For witchers who were not monsters despite the mutations, who retained human conscience and human capacity for regret, being able to say the father agreed, rather than we took the child by force, mattered. So the law of surprise became systematic practice, not the only method. Orphans were still taken, and occasional purchases still occurred when desperation warranted, but the preferred method, the one that witchers would invoke whenever opportunity presented itself. The opportunity required specific circumstances. A witcher had to encounter someone in mortal danger, had to successfully save that person's life, had to be offered payment or thanks sufficient to create the opening for invoking the law. Not every monster contract provided such opportunity. Most of the time, witchers were hired professionals performing predetermined service. They killed the beast, collected their coin, moved on. No life or death rescue occurred because the contract itself prevented anyone from being endangered during the kill. But sometimes, on the road between contracts, during unexpected encounters, in situations where the witcher was not there professionally, but simply happened to be present when crisis struck, the necessary circumstances aligned. A merchant attacked by bandits, saved by witcher passing through, a farmer dragged toward water by drowner, pulled free by witcher hunting that same drowner, a noble thrown from horse and facing ghoul pack, defended by Witcher tracking different prey. A soldier separated from his unit and about to be overwhelmed by neckers, rescued by Witcher who had been contracted to clear that same nest. In these moments when the saved person's gratitude overflowed, when they insisted on payment or reward, the Witcher could invoke the law. Give me what you find at home, yet do not expect. Sometimes the surprise was indeed a child. More often it was not. The gamble remained genuine. A Witcher might invoke the law a dozen times and receive only animals, crops, or awkward discoveries of adultery, but over centuries, across multiple schools and generations of Witchers, enough children were claimed to maintain recruitment. The children came to Kaer Morhen, or to the other schools, Griffin, Cat, Bear, Viper, Manticore, each of which operated its own stronghold, maintained its own traditions, conducted its own training. The specifics varied, but the essential pattern remained constant. The child was separated from their birth family. This separation was not always immediate. Some accounts suggested periods of adjustment, visits maintained for a time, gradual rather than abrupt severance. Others described immediate departure, the Witcher and child leaving as soon as the claim was acknowledged. Either way, the child eventually found themselves in the Witcher stronghold, surrounded by others like themselves, boys claimed by law of surprise, or acquired through other means, all gathered for the same purpose. Training began, physical conditioning, weapons practice, education in monster lore, learning to recognize the different varieties of necrophage, understanding the behavioral patterns of cursed ones, memorizing the vulnerabilities of relics and draconids and hybrids, herbalism, which plants could be safely consumed, which could cure, which could kill, how to prepare the decoctions that Witchers relied upon for enhanced performance. This training lasted years. The children who began at 5 or 6 might not face the trial of the grasses until adolescence. Those who began older had less time, but still underwent extensive preparation. The trials could not be rushed. The body needed development, the mind needed education, the spirit needed whatever hardening made it possible to face what was coming. And what was coming was horror. The trial of the grasses. The name itself suggested natural process, something organic and growth-oriented. The reality was alchemy at its most brutal, mutagens forced into bloodstream. Toxins that should kill, but were balanced against each other in careful proportions that allowed narrow path between death and transformation, fungal derivatives, viral agents, compounds whose exact composition remained secret even centuries later. The child, and they were still children even after years of training, was restrained. Had to be restrained, because the conscious mind would fight the process, would thrash and struggle, and potentially injure themselves fatally. They were given drugs to suppress resistance, but not enough to render them completely unconscious. They needed to remain present, in some sense, for the mutations to take hold properly. Then the mutagens were administered, multiple substances in sequence, each one triggering changes, forcing the body to adapt or die. Most died. The accounts disagreed on the survival rate. Some suggested 3 in 10 children survived. Some claimed the rate was worse, 1 in 10, 1 in 20. Some whispered that certain schools, certain generations, lost nearly all their candidates and had to begin recruitment again from nothing. What the accounts agreed upon, survival was not guaranteed. Being a child of surprise provided no immunity to the trial's dangers. Destiny might mark a child for witcherhood, but it did not make the path easier. Those who survived the initial trial were not done. They faced additional mutations, the changes, as they were called. More substances, more transformations, bone density increased. Muscle fiber was restructured. Metabolism was altered to process toxins that would kill normal humans. Sensory capabilities were enhanced. Vision adapted to darkness. Hearing sharpened to pick up frequencies beyond normal human range. Sense of smell developed to tracking useful acuity. And the eyes changed. Cat-slit pupils, enhanced light sensitivity, the feature that made Witchers immediately recognizable, impossible to hide in normal society. Some candidates died during the changes. Some survived but emerged damaged. Strength without coordination, senses without the neural processing to interpret them, bodies that had transformed incorrectly in ways that left them functional but monstrous. And some candidates, a small fraction of those who began the process, emerged as witchers, transformed, enhanced, capable of the work they had been trained for, still bearing their original personality, their human consciousness, but housed in body that was no longer entirely human. For those who survived, what followed was the remainder of their training, learning to use their new capabilities, mastering the signs, the simple but effective magic that witchers could perform, combat-oriented spells that required no lengthy ritual or extensive power, Igni for flame, Ard for force, Quen for protection, Erden for trapping, Axi for mental influence. Not powerful magic by mage standards, but sufficient for witcher needs. More weapons training, adapted now to enhance strength and speed, advanced monster hunting techniques, understanding of contracts and payment negotiation. Witchers might be mutated, but they still needed to eat, needed to maintain their equipment, needed income to survive. And then, when the witcher was considered ready, they took the path, left the safety of the stronghold to wander the world, seeking contracts, killing monsters, earning the living that would sustain them until they died, in combat from accumulating injuries, or in the rare cases where they survived long enough, from old age that came much slower than it came for normal humans. This was the end result of the Law of Surprises application to witcher recruitment. Children claimed through ancient custom, transformed through brutal alchemy, sent out to live dangerous lives hunting creatures most people preferred to pretend did not exist. One such child was Lambert. The accounts that survived regarding his origin suggested typical application of the law. A man, his father, though Lambert himself would later express complex feelings about applying that term, traveled on some business, drank too heavily, or simply stumbled in darkness, or was actively fleeing some threat. The exact circumstances varied by telling. What remained consistent? He encountered neckers, the small pack-hunting creatures that infested forests and caves throughout the northern kingdoms, that looked almost comical individually, but became deadly in numbers. They had swarmed him. He would have died. A witcher passing through, named in later accounts as Vesemir, though this detail might be retroactive addition after Vesemir became Lambert's mentor, heard the commotion, investigated, killed the neckers, saved the man's life. The man, grateful and perhaps still drunk enough to speak without careful thought, insisted on providing payment. The witcher had no need for coin at that moment, invoked the Law of Surprise instead. The man returned home, found his son there, Lambert, a boy young enough that the details of his childhood were not yet fixed in permanent memory. The first thing to greet the father was the child. The law had been satisfied. Lambert was taken to Kaer Morhen, was trained, survived the trials, though the accounts suggested the process left him particularly scarred, not physically, but psychologically. He became a witcher, skilled and effective. But he also became bitter, angry at the fate that had claimed him, resentful of the father who had agreed to the bargain, of the witcher who had invoked it, of the destiny that justified the entire arrangement. In later years, Lambert would speak with open hostility about his origins, would make clear that he considered the Law of Surprise a cruelty, that he had never wanted to be a witcher, that given choice he would have preferred any normal life to the mutations and the path, and the constant proximity to death. His testimony was valuable precisely because it was bitter. It provided counterpoint to romantic notions about destiny and calling. Lambert had been a child of surprise, marked by fate according to traditional understanding, and he hated what that marking had produced. Yet, he remained a witcher, continued to hunt monsters, continued to train when training was needed, continued to live the life he claimed to despise, whether this represented lack of alternatives. Witchers couldn't easily integrate into normal society. Their mutations marked them as other, or some deeper acceptance of his role that he refused to acknowledge. Even he might not have been able to say. Another child of surprise, in the accounts that circulated among witchers and in developer commentary regarding the games that would later depict their world, was Deirdre Adamain. Her story came from the school of the wolf, like Lambert's, but demonstrated different outcome. Eskel, a witcher roughly contemporary with Geralt of Rivia, had saved the life of a prince. The prince, as princes often did when saved from mortal danger, offered lavish reward. Eskel invoked the Law of Surprise, following the tradition, not knowing what the surprise would prove to be. The surprise was the prince's daughter, Deirdre. She came to Kaer Morhen. But unlike most children of surprise, Deirdre was female. This presented immediate complication. Witchers were exclusively male. The mutations had been developed on male subjects, calibrated to male physiology. Whether they could even be applied to female candidates was unknown. No one had tried, or if they had tried, no record of success survived. More fundamentally, the purpose of Witcher mutations was to create monster hunters. The work was physical, brutal, requiring strength and endurance. Cultural assumptions of the era held that women were unsuited to such labor. Whether these assumptions were accurate was beside the point. They were believed, and they shaped decision-making. So Deirdre could not become a Witcher in the traditional sense, but she had been claimed through the law of surprise. The bond existed. Simply releasing her, sending her back to her father, would violate the principle that made the law meaningful. The solution, in most cases where a child of surprise proved to be female, involved another ancient custom: exchange with the Dryads. The Dryads of Brokilon Forest, one of the few surviving Dryad communities, had their own recruitment problem. They did not reproduce in conventional fashion. Accounts varied on whether this was biological incapacity or cultural choice, but the result was the same. They needed young girls to adopt into their community, to teach their ways, to preserve their culture, and they had young boys. Occasionally, human girls who ran to Brokilon seeking refuge brought male siblings or gave birth to sons. These boys could not be raised as Dryads. They would eventually have to leave the forest, return to human society. An exchange made sense. Witchers would give the Dryads any female children of surprise. The Dryads would give the Witchers male children of appropriate age. Both parties acquired what they needed. This exchange happened with enough regularity that it became established procedure. When a Witcher arrived at Kaer Morhen with a girl, arrangements would be made. A trip to Brokilon, negotiations with the Dryad leaders, the transfer completed. The girl would be raised as Dryad, learning archery and forestcraft, and the particular magic that Dryads practiced. She would drink the waters of Brokilon, the substance that transformed human girls into Dryads, that gave them extended life and bound them to the forest. She would never become a Witcher, but she would find a different path, equally removed from normal human life. For the boy received in exchange, the path to Witcherhood opened. He would undergo the training, face the trials, emerge transformed or dead. The law of surprise had been honored, just indirectly. The destiny that marked children of surprise found expression just through alternative route. But Deirdre, according to accounts preserved in the game that depicted her story, did not follow this pattern. She was not exchanged. She remained connected to Eskel, her Witcher father, through the law. She was trained in combat to some degree, though not subjected to the mutations. And she lived with additional burden. She was cursed. The curse of the Black Sun, a supposed affliction that fell upon girls born during certain eclipses that marked them as potential bringers of destruction. Whether the curse was real or simply paranoid fantasy, whether Deirdre actually posed danger or was simply victim of superstition, the accounts did not definitively resolve. What mattered was that others believed her cursed and acted according to that belief. Her own brother eventually came seeking to kill her, considering her too dangerous to live. The events that followed were complex, involving Geralt of Rivia, who had arrived at Kaer Morhen during the crisis. The outcome was violent. Whether Deirdre survived, the accounts disagreed. Different versions of the story ended different ways. But her case illustrated important principle about children of surprise. The law bound them to their Witcher parent through something deeper than typical social obligation. Eskel could have exchanged her to the Dryads. He did not. The bond created by the law of surprise, whatever its mystical components, translated into a real relationship that transcended convenience. This brought the analysis to the most famous child of surprise in all Witcher lore, Cirilla Fiona Ellen Rhiannon, Princess of Sintra, granddaughter of Queen Calanthe, daughter of Pavetta and Duni, and twice claimed by Geralt of Rivia through the law of surprise. Twice. That detail was not incidental. The first claiming occurred at the feast of Pavetta's 15th birthday. Duni, cursed into hedgehog form, had arrived to claim Pavetta herself through the law of surprise. He had saved her father King Regnar's life years earlier. Calanthe resisted. Violence erupted. Geralt, present at the feast as guest, intervened to defend Duni's claim. When order was restored and Calanthe grudgingly accepted the betrothal, Duny insisted on rewarding Geralt. The Witcher had no particular need for reward, invoked the law of surprise more to satisfy Duny's honor than from expectation of valuable return. Give me that which you already have, but do not know. Pavetta immediately became ill, revealing her pregnancy. The child she carried was Ciri. The law bound Geralt to that child from before her birth. Geralt fled that connection for years, avoided Sintra, avoided Pavetta and Duny, refused to accept the destiny that traditional understanding suggested was now his to fulfill. He was Witcher. Witchers took children to transform them into more Witchers through brutal trials. He had no intention of subjecting a princess, a girl, to that horror. Better to ignore the bond entirely. But destiny, if such thing existed, was not so easily ignored. Years later, traveling after a contract, Geralt encountered a merchant under attack, saved the merchant's life. The merchant insisted on payment. Geralt, perhaps not even remembering the first invocation, or perhaps testing whether destiny was truly inescapable, invoked the law of surprise again. The merchant returned home, found Ciri there. During the chaos of Nilfgaard's invasion of Sintra, during Pavetta and Duny's death at sea, the child had ended up as war refugee taken in by the merchant's wife without the merchant's knowledge. The first thing to greet him was Ciri. The law had claimed her twice, different mechanisms, different circumstances, but same result. Geralt could not escape the bond. Destiny, through the machinery of the law of surprise, had spoken clearly. Ciri came to Kaer Morhen, was trained by Geralt and Vesemir and the few remaining Witchers of the Wolf School, but she was not subjected to the mutations. Geralt refused to allow it, and by that time the knowledge of how to perform the trials safely had been lost. She learned swordwork and monster lore, without the enhancements that normally accompanied Witcher training, and her connection to Geralt transcended normal parent-child relationship. The law of surprise, invoked twice, created bond that even the Dryads acknowledged could not be broken when suggestion was made that Ciri should be given to Brokilon, that she should drink the waters and become Dryad. The ritual itself rejected her. The destiny that bound her to Geralt was too strong. She remained his child of surprise, his daughter by law, regardless of any other consideration. Her story became legendary, the most famous child of surprise in living memory, proof that the law still functioned, that destiny still involved itself in human affairs through this ancient custom. But Ciri was also exceptional. Most children of surprise lived more obscure lives, served their function without becoming subject of songs and stories. They came to Kaer Morhen or the other schools, underwent the trials, became Witchers, or died. Those who survived went to the path, lived hard lives, died relatively young. Their names were not recorded. Their individual stories were not preserved. They existed as category rather than individuals. Children of surprise, unexpected children, the raw material that Witchers acquired through invocation of ancient law. By the time the accounts reached the present era, the time of Geralt and Ciri, the twilight years of the Witcher schools, the law of surprise was invoked rarely. The schools had declined. Kaer Morhen had been attacked and destroyed, its population of Witchers and students slaughtered. The knowledge needed to create new Witchers had been partially lost. Only a handful of Witchers remained, aging slowly through their mutations, walking the path because they knew no other life. They still hunted monsters, still took contracts, but they no longer recruited children. The creation of new Witchers had ceased, not through deliberate choice, but through accumulated loss. In that context, the law of surprise lost its primary institutional function. Individual Witchers might still invoke it when opportunity arose, habit, tradition, or genuine belief in destiny motivating the invocation. But no children would come to Kaer Morhen for training. No new mutants would be created. The children claimed, if any were, would have to find different path. Perhaps this represented the law returning to its original form. Before Witchers systematized its use, it had been personal custom. Individual debts between individual people, resolved through fate's mechanism. Children of surprise might be apprenticed to their claimant's trade. Whatever that trade was, might serve as household members, might simply live as adopted children, the bond of law substituting for blood relation. Without Witchers to claim them systematically, children of surprise would once again scatter into obscurity, living their lives marked by destiny, but not defined by a single path, the law itself would persist. Custom that old did not simply vanish, but its application would shift. Or perhaps witchers would endure longer than current evidence suggested. Perhaps new methods of creating them would be developed. Perhaps the scattered survivors would gather, pool their knowledge, find a way to continue the tradition beyond what seemed possible in the present moment. Either way, the connection between witchers and the law of surprise had been intimate for centuries, had shaped how both were understood in popular imagination. A witcher arriving to claim a child of surprise was a recognizable scenario, one that most people could envision even if they never witnessed it personally. And that meant the law of surprise, for all its ancient origins in devil bargains and biblical vows and Slavic folklore, had become in the common mind inseparable from witchers. Whether that association honored or diminished the law remained matter of perspective. There were exceptions. Every system, every custom, every attempt to codify human behavior into predictable patterns produced cases that did not fit. The law of surprise, despite its supposed ancient consistency, was no different. The accounts that survived preserved not only the standard applications, but also the edge cases, the unusual outcomes, the situations where the law's machinery produced results that challenged common understanding. Some of these were matters of refusal. What happened when the debt was denied? Zivelina's story had already established the cautionary principle: deny the law and suffer consequence. But her case involved a powerful person actively using magic and authority to drive away the one who held legitimate claim. Other forms of denial existed, more subtle, more passive. Consider the scenario where the saved person simply left, disappeared before the savior could return to collect the surprise, fled to another kingdom, changed their name, attempted to dissolve their identity, and emerged somewhere else as someone else. Did the law pursue them? Did their new identity protect them from old obligation? Or did the act of fleeing itself constitute violation sufficient to invoke whatever supernatural enforcement mechanism might exist? The accounts rarely address such cases directly. Perhaps they were uncommon. Fleeing one's entire life was not a trivial undertaking in times when travel was dangerous, and establishing new identity required resources most people lacked. Or perhaps such cases did occur, but were not considered worth recording, being failures of the system rather than interesting examples of its function. One fragmentary account suggested a man who attempted such flight. He had agreed to the law of surprise, discovered upon returning home that his surprise was his newborn daughter, and immediately fled rather than surrender her. He traveled far, to regions where his name was unknown, where he thought he could hide. He died within the year. The account attributed his death to fever, but contextualized it as obvious consequence of broken oath. Whether the fever was genuinely supernatural punishment or simply coincidental illness interpreted through lens of moral judgment, the account did not clarify. But the story carried additional detail. The daughter lived, the man died, but his family survived, and the debt transferred to his heirs. Years later, the one who had invoked the law tracked down the now adult daughter and claimed her for service of unspecified nature. The law did not forget, the law did not expire. Even death could not dissolve the obligation entirely. It merely shifted to those who inherited the deceased's estate and responsibilities. Whether this represented actual practice or simply storyteller's elaboration, meant to reinforce the law's seriousness, remained unclear. But it suggested that the law, in traditional understanding, functioned as obligation that transcended individual life. Once properly invoked, it existed independent of the parties involved, binding their descendants and heirs if necessary. This raised uncomfortable questions about consent. The person who agreed to the law of surprise made that agreement for themselves. Did they have authority to bind their children or grandchildren to obligations they personally would never fulfill? Could someone be born into debt they had no role in creating? By the standards of the time, apparently yes. Inherited debt was a common concept. Children inherited their parents' obligations along with their property. The law of surprise simply extended this principle to its logical extreme. Even debts, whose exact nature was unknown at the time of agreement, could be inherited. Modern sensibilities might find this troubling, but the societies that practiced the law operated under different assumptions about individual autonomy and familial obligation. The child was not a separate entity with independent rights, but rather extension of family unit. Obligations bound the family, not just the individual. Another category of exception involved confusion about what the surprise actually was. The phrasings used to invoke the law, "what you find at home yet do not expect," or "the first thing that greets you," were specific but allowed interpretation when a man returned home and multiple things greeted him simultaneously. Which was the surprise when he found several unexpected things, which satisfied the debt. One account preserved the story of a merchant who returned to find twins born during his absence. He had agreed to the law of surprise before departing. Both children came to the door when they heard his approach. Both qualified as surprises he did not know about. The one who held the claim, a sorceress in this version, argued that both children were the payment. The surprise was not one child, but two. They could not be separated. She claimed both. The merchant resisted, invoked local lord to arbitrate. The lord, after consulting with advisors and considering precedent, ruled that the claimant must choose the law, granted claim to the surprise, singular. When multiple surprises existed, the claimant selected which one satisfied the debt. The others remained with their original family. The sorceress accepted the judgment, chose the child who displayed signs of magical potential, her selection criterion being practical rather than arbitrary, and departed with that one twin. The other remained with the merchant. But alternate versions of similar scenarios suggested different outcomes. In some tellings, the claimant was entitled to all surprises discovered. In others, only the first thing to move or speak qualified. In still others, the ambiguity itself nullified the claim. The law required clear surprise, and when clarity was impossible, the debt was considered void. These variations likely reflected regional differences in custom or evolution over time, as edge cases forced refinement of the rules, or they simply demonstrated that the law, for all its supposed ancient authority, was ultimately human custom subject to human interpretation. Another edge case involved timing. What if the surprise was discovered but then lost before the claimant could collect? A farmer agreed to the law of surprise after being saved from bandits, returned home to find a foal born to his mare during his absence. Valuable surprise, useful to the one who saved him, but before the claimant could arrive to collect the foal, it sickened and died. Natural causes. No one's fault. Was the debt now void? Or did the farmer owe equivalent replacement? The accounts that touched on such scenarios disagreed. Some suggested the death of the surprise before collection constituted misfortune that dissolved the obligation. Others insisted the farmer now owed different payment of equivalent value, as if the foal had been sold and the proceeds were due. The most interesting interpretation, found in accounts that emphasized the mystical aspects of the law, suggested that the foal's death was itself meaningful. Perhaps it was not truly the surprise. Perhaps fate had designated something else, and the foal was coincidental. The claimant should wait because the real surprise had not yet been revealed. This interpretation aligned with the views of the law as destiny mechanism rather than simple transaction. If the law connected to fate, then the surprise that satisfied it could not be prevented by ordinary misfortune. Something else would emerge. The true payment would eventually manifest. Whether such theological interpretation reflected how people actually approached the law, or merely represented philosophical speculation by those who studied such customs, the accounts did not make clear. Then there were cases where the surprise proved dangerous. A witcher saved a nobleman's life, invoked the law of surprise, and the nobleman returned home to find a stray dog that had wandered into his hall. Mangy creature, half-starved, aggressive when approached. The first thing to greet him, technically, the surprise he did not expect to find. The witcher accepted the dog as payment, took it away, presumably attempted to train or rehabilitate it. The dog attacked him within days, had to be killed. The nobleman considered the debt satisfied. Payment had been rendered. That the payment proved worthless was the witcher's problem, part of the gamble inherent in the law. But alternate version of this scenario had the witcher returning to demand different payment. The dog being dangerous didn't constitute valid surprise. The law required the surprise to be something the saved person actually possessed, something of value. A dangerous animal that would immediately attack was not possession but liability. Therefore, the debt remained unfulfilled. The dispute escalated, eventually involved violence. The outcome varied by telling. Sometimes the witcher prevailed, sometimes the nobleman had him killed, sometimes they reached compromise. But the case illustrated important question. Could the surprise be rejected as invalid? If so, who decided validity? No clear answer emerged from the accounts. Perhaps this was intentional ambiguity, allowing flexibility for parties to negotiate outcomes rather than being bound by rigid rules. Or perhaps it represented genuine confusion, with different practitioners of the law holding different views on the matter. Related question: what if the surprise was another person's property? A man returned home to find valuable horse in his stable, placed there by someone else without his knowledge. He didn't own the horse, had no right to it, but it was technically present in his home unexpectedly. If someone had invoked the law of surprise on him, could they claim the horse? Common sense suggested no. One cannot give away what one does not possess, but the phrasing of the law spoke of what you find at home, not what you own at home. The ambiguity created potential for dispute. Accounts that addressed this typically concluded that the surprise must be something the person actually possessed, not merely encountered, but this raised further complications about what possession meant. Did it require formal ownership, or was physical custody sufficient? What about things the person had borrowed, or was holding temporarily for someone else? These questions might seem pedantic, legal technicalities of the sort that only scholars cared about, but they had real implications when the law was invoked, and valuable surprise appeared. The parties involved wanted clear understanding of what was owed and what could be claimed. In an absence of central authority to definitively settle such matters, the answers remained locally determined, negotiated between the specific individuals involved, or adjudicated by whatever authority structure existed in their region. The cases examined so far involved complications in determining what the surprise was, or whether it validly satisfied the debt. But another category of exception involved complications with the claimant themselves. What if the one who invoked the law died before collecting the surprise? Standard inheritance principles suggested the claim would pass to the claimant's heirs. The right to collect the surprise became part of their estate, transferred like property or other obligations. But some accounts suggested different interpretation. The law created personal bond between savior and saved. When either party died, the bond dissolved. A witcher invoked the law of surprise on a merchant. The merchant returned home to discover his wife pregnant. Classic scenario: child of surprise. But the witcher died hunting monsters before the child was born. When other witchers later arrived claiming the child for Kaer Morhen, the merchant refused. The original claimant was dead. The claim died with him. The child remained with their birth family. The witchers pressed the matter, argued that the claim belonged to the school, not the individual. That witcher who invoked the law did so on behalf of the brotherhood, and his death did not dissolve the obligation. The dispute could not be resolved peacefully, escalated to violence that left several people dead, and the child ultimately remaining with the merchant, who by that point had resources and motivation to defend against any future witcher claims. This scenario illustrated the practical limits of the law's authority. When the parties involved possessed comparable power and no external authority could impose settlement, the law became whatever the surviving party could enforce. Might didn't make right in any philosophical sense, but it made reality. Though the cautionary interpretation would suggest that the merchant's refusal invited misfortune, that breaking faith with the law, even when the original claimant was dead, still carried supernatural consequence, that his subsequent hardships, if any occurred, and accounts that included this detail could be suspected of embellishment, were punishment for a violation. This theological reading had to compete with more cynical interpretation. Powerful people often rejected obligations when they thought they could get away with it, and the law of surprise was no different from any other custom in that regard. Another rare case involved multiple claimants. Two people saved a man's life simultaneously. Both had equal claim to having prevented his death. Both invoked the law of surprise, but there was only one surprise waiting at home: a newborn son. Who had rightful claim? Both equally? First person to invoke the law? Person who contributed most to the rescue, if such thing could be determined? The accounts that touched on this scenario, and they were few, suggesting such situations were uncommon, provided no consistent answer. One version had the claimants agreeing to share custody of the child, splitting the year between them. Another had them negotiating other payment for one claimant, while the other took the surprise. A third version ended in violence between the claimants, with the victor claiming sole right. Perhaps the rarity of such cases meant no standard practice developed, or perhaps the accounts simply failed to preserve whatever standard practice existed. Either way, the multiple claimant scenario demonstrated that the law's supposed ancient clarity could break down when confronted with complications the original custom had not anticipated. Then there were cases where the surprise itself rejected the claim. This applied primarily to children old enough to understand and resist. A child of surprise who, upon learning of their status, refused to go with the claimant who fought, fled, or otherwise resisted the bond the law supposedly created. The traditional view held that such resistance was futile. The law bound the child regardless of their preferences. Destiny had marked them. Their path was set. Fighting against it would only bring suffering. But practical reality sometimes differed from tradition. A child who successfully fled and remained hidden could not be claimed. A child who found powerful protector willing to defy the law might remain unclaimed despite legitimate invocation. A child who waited until adulthood and then simply refused, backed by their own resources and connections, might prevail against the claim. Geralt's own story with Ciri touched on this. When he finally came to Cintra to claim his child of surprise, Queen Calanthe resisted, attempted to deceive him by presenting other children, trying to hide which was truly Ciri. When that failed, she tried to prevent future contact, to keep Ciri ignorant of her status as child of surprise. Calanthe was powerful. She commanded armies. She had resources to resist even legitimate claim backed by ancient law. And she did resist, successfully for years, keeping Geralt and Ciri apart despite the bond that supposedly connected them. Only the fall of Cintra, only Calanthe's death, and Ciri's desperate flight as refugee finally brought child and witcher together. Whether this represented destiny inevitably asserting itself, or simply contingent events that happened to serve Destiny's narrative, interpretations differed, but the case demonstrated that power could temporarily, perhaps even permanently, thwart the law of surprise. The mystical bond might exist, but physical reality still required the claimant to actually collect the surprise. If collection could be prevented through force or cunning, the law's authority meant little. This brought the examination to the question of consequences more broadly. What happened when the law was violated, when debts went unpaid, when the machinery of destiny was defied? Xivalina died of plague. The merchant who refused the Witcher's claim faced unspecified hardships. Various accounts suggested fever, misfortune, loss of prosperity, family tragedy. The implication was always the same: break faith with the law, suffer for it. But how did such consequences manifest? Were they direct supernatural intervention, divine or cosmic punishment for violation of sacred custom? Or were they simply the natural results of being known as Oathbreaker, of losing social standing and community support? Or were they confirmation bias and narrative construction? People who violated the law and subsequently suffered any misfortune had those misfortunes interpreted as punishment, while those who violated the law and continued to prosper were forgotten or their prosperity explained away as temporary. The accounts did not provide clear answer because the accounts themselves were shaped by belief in the law's binding nature. Stories that supported the law's authority were preserved and retold. Stories that contradicted it were suppressed or reinterpreted. This was not necessarily conscious manipulation. It was simply how cultural transmission worked. Communities preserved stories that reinforced their values. The law of surprise was valued custom. Therefore, stories about its violation leading to punishment were valuable stories. They taught the lesson that communities wanted taught. Whether that lesson reflected objective reality, whether violating the law truly did invoke supernatural consequence, remained matter of faith rather than evidence, though one could argue that the persistence of the custom itself constituted evidence. If the law was merely social convention with no force beyond human enforcement, if breaking it carried no real cost beyond social disapproval, would it have survived for centuries? Would people continue to honor debts that required giving up their children, their unexpected fortunes, their surprises? Perhaps they would, if the social pressure was sufficient. Perhaps they would not, and the law's survival suggested something more was at work. Or perhaps the question was malformed. Perhaps supernatural consequence and social consequence were not meaningfully distinct categories. Perhaps the weight of violated oath, the sense of debt unpaid, the knowledge that one had broken faith with the ancient custom, perhaps these psychological and social forces were themselves the mechanism by which destiny operated. Destiny need not be external force imposing its will. It could be internal recognition of what must be done, what path must be walked. what obligations must be honored. The law of surprise created destiny not through cosmic manipulation, but through human acknowledgement of debt beyond price. In this interpretation, children of surprise were not mystically marked by fate. They were marked by human decision, the decision of their parent to invoke the law, to accept its terms, to acknowledge that the debt they owed could not be paid in normal fashion. The mark was social and psychological rather than supernatural, but no less binding for it. Whether such naturalistic reading satisfied those who believed in the law's mystical dimensions was debatable, but it offered framework for understanding the law's function that did not require accepting existence of cosmic destiny as active force in human affairs. As the centuries progressed and the Witcher schools declined, as the systematic use of the law for recruitment faded, the custom itself underwent subtle transformation. It remained known, remained part of cultural inheritance, but its application became rarer, more scattered, more individual, rather than institutional. In the present era, the time of the last Witchers, the twilight of an age, the law of surprise existed primarily as historical curiosity. People knew of it the way they knew of many ancient customs, as something that used to be practiced, that might theoretically still be invoked, but that most would never personally encounter. Young people heard the stories, Zatret Varuta given to the dwarves, Mad Day and the curse-lifting child, Zivalina who refused and died, Geralt and Ciri bound by double invocation. These tales circulated in taverns, were retold by bards, appeared in written chronicles for those few who could read. But the stories had begun to feel like folklore, like myths from an earlier time when destiny was more tangible, when fate involved itself directly in human affairs, when debts beyond price could be resolved through simple formula of invocation and surprise. Whether this represented actual change in how the world functioned, or merely change in how people thought about the world, the result was the same. The law of surprise, while not forgotten, had lost much of its previous authority and frequency of use. It persisted as option, as possibility. Someone might still invoke it when circumstances aligned properly, but they would do so knowing that enforcement would be difficult, that resistance would be common, that the mystical binding that supposedly made the law absolute had weakened or perhaps never existed in the form the story suggested. And yet, stories continued to circulate about coincidences too perfect to be coincidental, about children of surprise who found their way to the ones who claimed them despite all obstacles, about debts unpaid leading to inexplicable misfortune, about the sense of rightness when the law was honored, the sense of disturbance when it was not. Perhaps these were mere pattern recognition errors, humans seeing meaning in random events. Perhaps the law had never possessed the power attributed to it, and all the stories were elaborate fiction, or perhaps destiny, whatever that word meant, truly did work through the mechanism of the law of surprise. Perhaps some debts really were too great for ordinary payment. Perhaps fate really did mark certain children for paths they would walk regardless of resistance. The Witchers, who dealt with impossibilities daily, who hunted creatures that should not exist, and used magic that defied explanation, tended toward belief they had seen too much strangeness to dismiss the possibility that ancient custom carried actual power. But even among Witchers, doubt existed. Lambert scorned the entire concept. Others were more circumspect, acknowledging possibility while refusing certainty. A few, perhaps including Geralt himself, though his thoughts on the matter were complex, accepted the law as real but questioned whether its reality was mystical or merely very effective social technology. The debate could not be resolved, not through argument, not through evidence, perhaps not through any means available to mortal understanding. The law of surprise operated at the intersection of human will and cosmic fate, assuming such intersection existed. Proving its mechanisms would require proving fate itself, and that was task for gods or philosophers, not Witchers. What could be stated with certainty was that the law had shaped lives. Children had been claimed, raised by those who were not their birth parents, sent down paths they would not otherwise have walked. Some became heroes. Some lifted curses. Some became Witchers and walked the path until death claimed them. Some died young, in plague or accident or violence. Whether those outcomes were determined by the law or merely influenced by it or completely independent of it remained unclear. But the law had existed, had been invoked countless times across centuries, had created bonds and obligations that persisted even when the parties involved resisted them. That was enough for history. The rest, whether destiny was real, whether fate intervened, whether cosmic justice punished oathbreakers, could remain in the realm of belief rather than knowledge. The law of surprise endured not because its supernatural elements could be proven, but because it served function. It resolved debts that otherwise could not be resolved. It created mechanism for accepting fate's role in human affairs. It bound communities through shared recognition of obligations beyond material exchange. In time, it might fade entirely, might become nothing more than tale told to children, cautionary story about keeping one's word, might be remembered the way ancient religious practices were remembered, as something people used to do, that used to matter, that no longer had place in modern world. Or it might persist, might continue being invoked by those who saved lives and received thanks beyond what coin could express, might continue binding children to unexpected destinies, might continue serving as evidence that some debts transcended accounting, that some obligations required surrender to forces larger than individual will. Either way, its legacy was secured. The law of surprise had left its mark on the continent's history, on Witcher tradition, on the stories people told about destiny and debt and the cost of life saved. In the grand accounting, perhaps that was sufficient. Perhaps the law did not need to be eternal to have mattered. Perhaps its time was passing, but its time had been significant while it lasted. The Witchers who invoked it, the children who were claimed by it, the families who struggled with it, the communities that enforced it, all of them participated in tradition older than kingdoms, deeper than law, as mysterious as destiny itself. And in the end, mystery was appropriate. Some things resisted explanation. Some customs functioned precisely because their mechanisms remained opaque, their authority unquestioned by rational analysis. The law of surprise was debt that bound time. It reached backward to ancient origins in folklore and sacred text. It reached forward to futures determined by children not yet born when the bargain was made. It existed outside normal temporal flow, connecting past and future through mechanism of present surprise. That it did so imperfectly, that exceptions existed, that violations occurred. These facts did not diminish its significance. They merely proved that it was human custom, shaped by human limitations, subject to human interpretation. And human customs, even ancient ones, even those supposedly backed by cosmic authority, remained ultimately human, changeable, contingent, meaningful. Not because they were perfect, but because people chose to honor them. The law of surprise was honored for centuries, would perhaps continue to be honored in diminished form for centuries more. That was his truth. That was his legacy. A debt beyond price, paid through fate's selection, a bond beyond choice, accepted through destiny's mechanism, a custom beyond age, preserved through cultural transmission. The law of surprise, as old as humanity itself. For those who have walked this path through the history and manifestation of the law of surprise, who have seen how ancient, custom-shaped lives and destinies across the centuries, further chronicles await. The world of the Witchers holds countless such threads, each one deserving examination. Those who wish to understand more would do well to seek them out, to share this knowledge with others who value the deep lore of the continent. The stories endure because they are shared. The customs persist because they are remembered.